afterwards, along with other additional materials. So you will have a recording and all of the materials sent out after. Also, if you have any questions, please, we will have a Q&A section at the end. So please hold off your questions until then. And if we can go to the next slide. So this is the National Refugee Advocacy All Participant Training. So welcome and thank you for joining. We are really, really grateful for you to register and participate in this really important upcoming advocacy days. So today we're going to cover a lot. We're going to go over the background for our advocacy days. We're going to do a quick Refugee 101 with updated numbers and statistics. We're going to go over some meeting logistics, our policy asks, some of the talking points, a couple of items on comms and media, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So let's continue on to the next slide. So for those of you who don't know, just a quick background about We're All America. So We're All America is a national campaign. We work to uphold and strengthen our nation's commitment to welcome and protect those who are seeking freedom, safety, and refuge in this country. We really focus around organizing at the national level and also at the local level. As you can see on this picture, these are some of our steering committee partners. And we started out back in 2017 when we saw the need to organize and bring together refugee resettlement agencies and advocates and immigrant rights organizations. And throughout the year, we have been growing through our organizing effort on behalf of refugees and asylees and other immigrants in this nation. So that's a little bit about We Are All America. And let's go on to the next slide. So for our advocacy days, we are organizing with our refugee and immigrant leaders from the Opportunity for All table and all of our national partners. This is our first national refugee advocacy days that we are going to be hosting during the August recess while members of Congress are back in their home states. This is an opportunity for us to really build on the momentum that we started back in May during our CUSA advocacy days, which some of you may or may have not participated in. And so there's really two main goals for this advocacy days. Number one is to advocate for pro-refugee and asylum legislation to hold the current administration accountable in rebuilding and re-strengthening the resettlement program and asylum protection. And then the second goal is to engage refugee and immigrant leaders in direct advocacy with members of Congress. So let's go on to the next slide. So we plan to have this during the week of August 22nd through August 26th. Each meeting date and time will really be different, but it will happen during work hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Some of you may have one meeting, some of you may have 2 or 3 meetings, which we'll go over in a little bit. And so it'll really be based on the congressional offices and their availability. And so I think as far as why we are doing this, as you all know, right now we are at a really critical time with rebuilding and the need to rebuild the resettlement program and asylum protections. There was a lot of damage that has been done to the resettlement program and a lot of work that still needs to be done. In addition to that, America is really looked at as a global leader when it comes to protecting those who are seeking refuge and asylum. And so we need to continue to hold our elected officials and the administration accountable to follow through and continuing to be a global leader in this area on vulnerable populations and those seeking refuge. So that being said, we're going to transition over to a little bit about giving you more of a global picture where we're at and also here in the States with updated statistics. So if we can continue on to the next slide. And let's go into the next slide. As far as where we're at with global trends, and if we can go to the next slide, Andres. right now, we, in the first months of 2022, we have passed the 100 million mark of people who are globally displaced worldwide as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, or human rights violations. So this number has drastically increased over the last couple of years, particularly in this last year. Out of these 100 million, we're seeing over 26 million refugees in the world. That's really the highest number we've ever seen of people who have been, displaced, and now because of turmoil or conflict in their homelands have now had to flee to another country. Over 50 million are internally displaced. That means that they're still in their country, but they are displaced from that region or that area. Over 4.4 million asylum seekers and 4.1 million Venezuelans who are displaced abroad. So that's kind of a global picture of the numbers and recent statistics. If we can go on to the next slide, you'll kind of see the breakdown of the numbers of different categories. So we're seeing right now 69% originate from these 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. So this is where we're seeing most refugees flee from. And the top 5 countries that are hosting refugees, as you can see, the United States is not on this list. It includes Turkey, Colombia, Uganda, Pakistan, and Germany. So that's kind of like the global trends and statistics we are seeing. And if we can go on to the next slide. And many of you probably know this statistic. What is the average time refugees spend at a camp? Can y'all take a guess? Maybe put it in the chat box. 17 years. 10+ years. Yes, that is correct. 10 years is the average time frame that refugees spend at a camp. I've met many families whose children were born and raised in refugee camps. So it's definitely a really, really long time to spend in a place where you don't really have a home. And let's go on to the next slide. When it comes to durable solutions, there are really 3 durable solutions that the UNHCR proposes. Number 1 is the voluntary repatriation to their home countries. And what this means is, having people go back to their home countries. And for most people who are refugees themselves, most people want to go back. They don't want to leave their homes. And I can speak on that from a personal perspective because I'm a former refugee myself. And so, most people want to go back home. However, oftentimes this is not a feasible option. There's still violence and conflict going on back in your home country, and it's not a possible option. The second durable solution is integration into their country of asylum. And so what this means is this person now has left their country and possibly crossed a bordering country. And now this is where they're seeking their country of first asylum. And one example can be folks who left from Afghanistan and now they're seeking asylum. Their country of first asylum is Pakistan. Oftentimes this is not a permanent place that they can stay and start and rebuilding a new life. There could be safety concerns. There could be issues and matters with not being able to get legal status in that country. And oftentimes it's a temporary place where people stay. And so that's when people go through the resettlement process of applying through the UNHCR, and which it really is resettlement to a third country and getting approved. When it comes to statistics on the number of people who are resettled to a third country, less than 1% are actually able to get resettled to a third country of asylum. And let's go to the next slide. Now I'm going to shift a little bit just to go over some of the most recent trends and numbers when it comes to refugee admissions here in the States. So this report is about from 2 weeks ago. As you know, and many of you know, President Biden set the admissions cap for FY 2022 at 125,000. We, as of right now, have resettled about 15,000, a little over 15,000 refugees. So that's about 16% of our goal, which is not nearly as close to reaching that 125,000 cap. The top 5 countries of origin from those that have come in, certainly we did receive folks from Afghanistan through the evacuation last year, but when it comes to the actual resettlement program, the top 5 countries are from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Sudan, Burma, and Ukraine. And the top 5 states that are welcoming refugees that we're seeing is California, Texas, New York, Michigan, and Washington. So that kind of gives you an idea, and we can go to the next slide. That kind of gives you an idea of the states that we're receiving and also where we're at as far as the resettlement program. For those of you who don't know, the federal fiscal year starts every October 1st and ends every September 30th. So right now we're reaching the end of federal fiscal year 2022 at the end of September, and we will start the FY 2023 as of October 1st. And so we still have a lot of work to do to reach that number. When it comes to the resettlement program and the process for the screening, I'm not going to go through every step-by-step on this, but this chart kind of guides you of the process that it takes. Refugees go through an extensive vetting process. And it could take anywhere from 18 months to 3 years or even longer. They do have to be referred to the US. They do have to do certain in-person interviews and be cleared and go through a rigorous clearance process and DHS approval. They also have to go through medical screenings that have specific expiration dates. And then once all of that has been done, they are assigned to a national refugee resettlement agencies and eventually will be resettled to one of the states here. They will go through a cultural orientation training and will be welcomed at the airport and apartments set up for them. And then the resettlement agencies locally then take over to help with that resettlement process. So that's kind of a basic Refugee 101 and updated statistics. I know for many of you, you already know this information, but there are some folks that this is new for, so just wanted to kind of go through that. I'm happy to answer any questions at the end, but I think for now, we're going to shift to talk a little bit about some of the meeting logistics. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so what is your role as a participant? Number 1 is to really be in touch with your group lead and participate in the group prep call that will happen. If you haven't already had one, it's probably going to happen this upcoming week. Also, to review some of the material that we provide to you, like the participant handbook and the rest of the prep material. And then finally, the most important is to participate in the congressional meetings with your delegation and advocate for refugees. So that's really your main role when it comes to participation in this advocacy days. As far as meeting and logistics, if we can go to the next slide. So meetings will happen ideally in person in local congressional offices. Some meetings may happen virtually depending on the office and the availability of your group, and also if it makes sense geographically. I know some of you live in very large states and where you may not be able to drive, a couple hours for a meeting. So we certainly would not want to have you do that as well. So some of these meetings will happen virtually or maybe in smaller groups. your group lead and accompanier will be setting up the meeting on your behalf. And I do apologize, I hear some background noise, so if y'all can please mute your phone, your audio if you haven't already, I'd appreciate it. And then final schedules will likely not be available until later on, probably sometime next week. And I just want to forewarn everyone, these are subject to change last minute by congressional offices. We kind of don't have control over that at times. So just want to give you a heads up that it is a possibility that may happen. We expect you to attend no more than 2 or 3 legislative meetings, although there are some states that, a few states that do have a few more congressional targets, but your group lead accompanier will work with you if there are more than 2 or 3 meetings. Be sure to be prepared for meetings to last 15 to 30 minutes, and based on that time frame, you know, really working with your group to kind of develop the right talking points, considering that you have only 15 to 30 minutes. And also please be aware that you may or may not meet with actual members of Congress. I've had meetings where I've been able to meet directly with the member of Congress, and I've also had meetings where I'm meeting with their staffers. So it really depends. Let's go on to the next slide. If you are meeting virtually, prior to the meeting, just make sure that if you're, if it's a Zoom call or whatever platform it is, that you check your software, your audio and your video feed and quality. I've had that happen to me where I'm getting ready to log on to a virtual meeting with an elected official, and then I had to do a software update, and so it was like the worst timing. So just make sure you have all the update plugins that this for your software before using that meeting. Also make sure you mute yourself when you're not talking, that way there's not all of this audio background. It can be really distracting. Make sure that you log on a few minutes early with your group. I would say at least 10-15 minutes early, so everyone is there and that you are on time. If you're not able to be on time, please text your group lead or an accompanier if you're not able to attend, if you have an urgent matter come up. When you do speak, make sure you speak clearly and make sure your remarks are brief. If you are, and we do ask that you please be on video and that your lighting source is in front of you, so your face is well illuminated. Let's go on to the next slide. So as far as your delegation coordination, during your prep call with your group lead or your accompanier, you guys will go over everyone's roles and talking points, your participant handbook, your congressional bio, and your policy ask. So during that call, you will really go over all of that and what everyone is going to be saying and your talking points, just so you feel readily prepared for the meetings. And your accompanier will provide you also the meeting date, the time, and the location. If for whatever reason you haven't heard from your group lead or your accompanier by next week, make sure you contact me immediately, and I will put my email in the chat box and in these slides. But if you haven't heard from them, I would say by mid next week, please let me know, and I will make sure to connect you to your group lead. All right, I think I covered my section. That being said, I am going to turn it over to my colleague who's going to talk more about the policy and the policy ask and go over that with you. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my colleague Jennifer Aranquillo, who is the Senior Strategist, U.S. Policy and Advocacy with HIAS. And Jennifer, I turn it over to you.
Hey, everybody. Great to be with you. And I'll just start with that. HIAS is one of 9 resettlement agencies responsible in contract with the U.S. government to settle initially and then get refugees assimilated into the United States. And they've been doing that work for quite some time. So I've been in DC area about 16 years, spent almost a decade on Capitol Hill. So I was often on the receiving end of these meetings as congressional staff, not specifically on these issues, but other issues. So do not be afraid if this is your first type of meeting, whether the member shows up or not, or it's just staff. But to the extent you can really share your personal stories, and we'll go over that a little later on, but that's the most important thing to make that connection, whether the meeting lasts 10, 15 minutes or 30 minutes. So we can go to the next slide. And I will say also from the outset that my specific policy expertise is primarily in the refugee space, not so much the asylum, but we're going to pretty much boil all of this down to maybe 1-2 really important asks for you in these meetings. I guess the top line is the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, which was created pursuant to the Refugee Act of 1980, which was an overwhelmingly bipartisan supported piece of legislation. That's right, bipartisan piece of legislation. And the United States has been a leader in resettling refugees since that time. There was a bit of a blip on the screen during the Trump administration, which I actually worked in. And handled the refugee and humanitarian portfolio at the White House for half of the administration. We can talk about that another time. But other than that blip on the screen, the United States has been a leader. Also strengthening our U.S. asylum and humanitarian programming in the United States, protect stateless people in the U.S., and then also support of strong funding for our USRAP, our backlog. As many of you may know, there's a 1 million case backlog in the U.S. asylum system, and that is extraordinarily problematic. There never seems to be enough funding addressing the backlog, but notwithstanding, people are still seeking asylum coming over the border, those who can get through Title 42. So it's a real sort of pressure point. Next slide, please. Sorry, hold on there. Okay, so every year, the president makes a determination for the top line of refugee admissions to the United States. As was stated earlier, last year's top line was 125,000. Sadly, only 15,000 have been admitted to date. Notwithstanding, WAAA, as well as others, are strongly recommending next year's refugee admission to set a goal of 200,000. That does sound like a large number, but with your efforts and advocacy efforts to members of Congress and Senate to essentially restore what USRAP used to be, maybe not quite at those high numbers, but in light of the 26 million refugees that we have to date, we are confident that that number could be met with a little bit of pressure on our administration as well as those in Congress. Specifically, 3 big points of legislation, but I'll really highlight the first. The Afghan Adjustment Act, as some of you may have heard, that was recently introduced in the Senate, I believe on Sunday, and in the House of Representatives on Wednesday. Phenomenal accomplishment. The legislation was not passed in either house, but just to get it introduced in a bipartisan, bicameral, which many of you know means both the House and the Senate side, was absolutely outstanding. So this sets everyone up in the next couple of weeks to do these strong advocacy efforts with a lot of momentum and wind behind them to really stress when members get back to Congress in September to pass in their respective houses the Afghan Adjustment Act. The Refugee Protection Act is an important piece of legislation that comes up regularly in Congresses. It's really to strengthen the infrastructure of USRAP, set a floor of minimum refugee admissions. There is some support for that, but we keep biting at that apple with each Congress. And then, of course, our federal funding, the appropriations process has begun. It is supposed to be wrapped up by the start of every fiscal year. That never happens. Essentially, we can go into this in more detail if anyone has any questions. Congress will come in and put what they call a continuing resolution to continue funding at the levels of this current fiscal year until they pass new appropriations. But every year, this coalition and others request strong, robust funding on the Refugee Resettlement Program, USCIS, which handles asylum and significant other accounts at State Department with PRM. Next slide, please. And if anybody has any questions on, anything I'm going over, feel free to ask at the end. So asylum, what I'll say here, I'm just going to summarize. One, you may have seen that the Remain in Mexico policy has been terminated. The Supreme Court held in a 5-4 decision a month or so ago. And now DHS has finally taken steps after some formal requirements had to come to actually dismantle the program. So that is great. But the major issue currently on asylum is removal of Title 42, which was put in place under the Trump administration. It's a public health provision that essentially got put into place to for COVID-19, and what it did was essentially impede the ability of those at the border to seek asylum. It's been incredibly problematic, and there have been strong efforts to remove that, and the Biden administration has continued it. We can go into a discussion on why that may be the case or why that may not be the case, but Title 42 amendments by Republicans do keep coming up in legislation. We just recently fought back several of them in the Inflation Reduction Act, which was on the floor in the Senate on Saturday into Sunday, and is currently, I think right now, on the floor in the House. So advocacy efforts, we were all successful in beating back any attempts to codify Title 42, which would essentially continue to prevent people showing up at the border from seeking asylum. The Biden administration has indicated that they will be lifting it, but they haven't as of yet. So in your meetings 2 weeks from now, depending on who you're meeting with, you should be asking for your member or senator to put continued pressure on the Biden administration to lift Title 42. We can go to the next slide. I'm not going to go every point by point. This one, if this speaks to any of you who are in these meetings, most certainly raise this issue. Stateless people are individuals who lack citizenship to any country. There are people truly without a home. And without citizenship, stateless people are often denied essential basic rights, and they are completely in an arbitrary situation. So if this speaks to any of you, certainly bring it up. Next slide, please. We talked a little bit about this on the backlog of 1 million caseload asylum backlog. A lot of this I'm going to let you decide whether or not, which, as Nada pointed out, your group lead in your discussions, try to figure out what you want to highlight. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, that was it. All right, so what I'll summarize is the AAA, incredibly important, removing Title 42 and asylum, incredibly important. Those are the two main policy asks that you should be going into these meetings with. Your refugee story, anything you want to raise, but I would tell you from a legislative perspective, from an administration perspective, the AAA and removing Title 42 to the situation at the border are the two most important points. And I'm happy to answer questions later. Back to you, Nita.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We will send out a detailed document with the policy ask that provides more background for review. We also will provide just like a one-pager overview of these top 4 policy asks, and then, as I mentioned, the detailed document. And as Jennifer mentioned, we really leave it up to your discretion with your group lead, and also depending on your congressional target, which of these policy conversations to really have. As Jennifer mentioned, our top priorities really now the Afghan Adjustment Act and around Title 42 around asylum. So, And Meredith is asking if we have any updates about the Afghan Adjustment Act. Do you want to quickly answer that, Jennifer?
Yeah, I can quickly answer that and then also tell you who the bill sponsors were. So incredibly important. There's been a lot of work done on this over the last year, essentially since the fall of Kabul and evacuees started appearing in the United States. Major veterans groups, advocacy organizations, immigrant groups have banded together and have been lobbying this issue for a very long time. So we were beyond delighted that it was introduced in both houses of Congress in a bipartisan way. Thank you. Someone including all those. Yeah, Coons, Klobuchar, Blumenthal, senators, Democrat. Graham, Blunt, Murkowski, Republican on the Senate side. On the House side, on the Republican side, it was Representatives Mayer, Kissinger, Miller Meeks, and Upton. On the Democrat side, Blumenauer, Nadler, Lofgren, Crow, and Peters. So introduced just this week. We are hopeful with everyone's advocacy efforts by this group. My own organization, HIAS, is doing their advocacy week next week. And while the members and senators are in their districts this August, meeting with constituents, people like yourselves, that we will really beat this drum and be requesting that when they come back in September to pass it. And the vehicle we are all looking towards is that continuing resolution vehicle. I mentioned earlier, the government has to continue to operate and hopefully not a shutdown. No one's talking of that. So to include additional monies is sort of a must-pass piece of legislation in September, and to potentially tack the Afghan Adjustment Act into that would give this piece of legislation a real fighting chance. But like I said, we've got the momentum on our side. Veterans groups are also taking to district offices throughout August to really drive home that point. We have bill language. I can send that to you, Nada, if you want to get that out. And also what we call in Washington a section by section, which is a small summary of each provision of the bill. We do have some talkers, but if anyone's interested, we can get that to you. But that's the latest state of play.
We will provide the actual bill text in the leave behind packet for your staffers, and also a one-pager for you all. That way you know where the bill is, what it includes, who the current co-sponsors are, and thank you, Neely, for putting that in the chat box as well. So you will receive that information. So as you can see, these advocacy days, you all play a really critical point, and it's really good timing that we're hosting this during this time. Also, HIAS, as Jennifer mentioned, will be hosting theirs next week. So we need to continue to build the momentum and get as many co-sponsors as possible. So that being said, thank you so much, Jennifer. Hopefully you are able to stick around if there are any questions. Now we're gonna shift over to the meeting agenda and some of the more specific talking points. So I'd like to introduce my colleague Neely Yosinger, who is the Executive Director for Refugee Congress, who's gonna cover this section. Neely, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Nada, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and thank you so much for putting the time into the training and these meetings. It's going to be really, really fantastic and important. I think most folks know this is the first time we're doing a refugee and immigrant-led advocacy days, and we're really excited about it. So what I'm going to be walking through is a little bit of a sample meeting agenda and some of the talking points that may come up during your meetings. The purpose of these meetings is, of course, to share about the issues that we care about. It's to make these asks of our elected officials clear, but it's really about building a rapport. And that's really how we get our asks across. That's how we get these offices to connect and to care about the things that we care about. It's by building that rapport. So with that in mind, everything that we're going to talk about in this section can really be considered guidance. Your group lead will really help you put together your agendas and assign the roles and talking points. So you shouldn't feel like anything that we put in here is a requirement or set in stone or must be done exactly as it's laid out. You'll see there's a lot of talking points, so there's no expectation that everyone's going to go through them. So here's an example of a meeting agenda. For many of you for many who have done this before, this is probably looking quite familiar. And it's pretty straightforward. So, introducing yourself and your group, which will usually be done by the group lead, and thanking the office, in particular, if that, thank the representative who, and talk about We Are All America. So I'm going to explain the purpose of your meeting and why you care about what you're doing, what it is that you want. So you're going to want to be clear about what your asks are of the member. And then to close, make sure that you're leaving time for staffers to ask questions. Always end the meeting by thanking the office and letting them know that they will get follow-up resources and information. So this is generally how the meetings will go. Your group lead will obviously arrange with you all a conversation and an agenda and assign different roles and talking points. So number of different sections of talking points. So for the who you are, at a base level, you're part of the We Are All America related constituents from particular state and particular district, depending on who you're meeting for. You're a supporter of refugees. You'll want to talk about, your experience and your values. You want your elected official to care about refugees. And so this is why you're having this conversation. And to find common ground and share your story where it's helpful. So again, it's really about building that rapport. These are guidance points. You won't necessarily use them all. The most important thing is really to listen and to connect with them. If you can go on to the next slide. Next slide. So at a baseline, you're also going to want to just talk briefly related to what Nada shared and what Jennifer shared, that resettlement in general is a long tradition of ours. It's been around for more than 4 decades. It enjoys bipartisan support. Since its inception, we have welcomed more than 3 million refugees in the United States. And there has also been shown, of course, of late that we have nationwide support, particularly for Afghans and Ukrainians now. And that really demonstrates that we are capable of welcome and that we should be restoring our humanitarian protection programs, that it is a deep part of our American values. Next slide. So explaining to the office why they should care about refugee resettlement. So of course, it's about humanitarian values. We have always been a leader in this space. It's a life-saving program. It's necessary and important to rebuild it because of those reasons. It's also a secure program. So, there's a lot of false narrative that we hear in the media that we've seen kind of come out from the in recent years, that refugee resettlement is not secure, and that's not true. It is a perfectly secure, perfectly vetted program. There's no reason to think that it is not secure. And resettlement is local. Refugees are strong contributors in big parts of our communities at a local level. Your congressional representatives also represent they represent their local constituents. So resettlement really is local. Next slide. Couple of specific things that'll probably come up, of course, talk about Afghan evacuees and the Afghan Adjustment Act. So just to give a few talking points about what that is, as it comes up in conversation, over 70,000 Afghans have been brought to the US under humanitarian parole. The humanitarian parole provides 2-year protections for Afghans, and after that, they have to find other means to lawfully stay in the US. And that is why it's critical that the Afghan Adjustment Act be passed to normalize evacuees and give them status, and ultimately keep our promise to them. Congress has passed this kind of Adjustment Act for other wartime evacuations to the US, including Cubans and Vietnamese, Cambodians, multiple generations of Iraqis. And so we want to make sure that we are doing the same here and keeping our promise. And we don't want that inaction to end up being, we don't want it to be a failure. The Afghan Adjustment Act has already been introduced in both chambers, as we talked about this week, and we'll be able to provide you with more information to leave behind with your after your meetings. Next slide. So Ukrainian refugees. So President Biden announced the Uniting for Ukraine program to welcome, with the goal of welcoming 100,000 Ukrainians who have been displaced. Majority of them are going to be entering through humanitarian parole. It's a very It's the same legal status as evacuated Afghans, but a little bit different in process, different aspects to it, which we can also provide more information on. But like evacuated Afghans, Ukrainians who are unable to return home after their parole period finishes are going to need to get some other protection status, and it puts their long-term safety on shaky ground. Many Ukrainians are coming in right now through sponsorship. There's been about 90,000 sponsor forms that have been filled to date. And there's almost 30,000 Afghans who have already arrived in the US. Next slide. And so what are our asks? It's one, we want to rebuild and strengthen the US refugee admissions program. We want to restore full access and strengthen US asylum and humanitarian protections. We want to protect the rights and status for stateless people in the US. And we want the right to legal representation and federal funding to expand legal representation services and backlog reduction efforts. So at a base, these are the 4 takeaway asks that we are going for. Next slide. And then after your meeting. So once your meeting is done, you're going to want to take a few minutes as a team to talk about how it went. You want to sort of process what you heard, what you learned. Make sure you achieved your goals. So really the goal was, of course, to share your asks and make sure they understand clearly what your requests are from the member of Congress. Make sure that you connected with them. You'll want to talk a little bit about how the team meeting went. You know, this is the first time we're doing this advocacy days. And so there's a lot of lessons learned about how we can do it differently moving forward. What do we want to improve upon? What do we want to do again? So it's really helpful and important that this debrief happen. And then talk about next steps. And of course, this isn't a one-time action. We want to be building a relationship with these policymakers for the future. So this isn't a one-off meeting. It's the start of a new relationship. And so after this debrief meeting, you're going to want to make sure that you really do send them whatever follow-up information was promised. You'll want to make sure if they ask questions and you didn't have the information that you follow up with them. It's really important not to guess, by the way. So I know that seems obvious, but if you don't know the answer to a question they have, it's okay to say you don't have that information, but you will follow up with them afterwards. And then, of course, it's really important to thank them for their time. You know, one of the things that often comes out of these meetings, you know, sometimes they go according to plan, sometimes they're really by the book in terms of following the agenda. Sometimes they're not. I've been in meetings where we've ended up spending 15 minutes talking about local restaurants, because sometimes that's how you connect with people first before you go into conversation about the topics at hand. And that's okay. You want to be able to connect with people, connect with this office, build that long-term relationship, and make sure they understand why refugees are important in our communities and what it is that we want them to do about it. So I think with that, I will leave it there.
Thank you so much, Neely. I hope that was helpful to you. If you feel overwhelmed, please don't. As Neely mentioned, the idea is not that you go over every single talking point that we shared. We just want to give you as many resources and tools as possible. But the most important part is that you are authentic and that you really connect with the staffer or the member of Congress, and you share with them, you know, why this is so important to you. So I hope that, you know, if anything you get out of that is that. That being said, we're gonna kind of wrap up a little bit before we go to Q&A around comms and media, what the expectations around that are, and some resources. So I'm going to turn it over to our digital organizer with We Are All America, Andres Bautista, to talk a little bit about that. Andres?
Hi, everyone. So I wanted to share that for utilizing social media, that we do have a social media toolkit. It has a couple prompts and other information, including some graphics on things that you can post in order to bring more awareness about what's been going on. So just kind of a couple pointers is if you can be able to take a picture, take a selfie either before or after your meeting, and then either send it to me or someone from the We Are All America staff, or even being able to post it on your own social media accounts using the hashtags that are listed on here as well. As mentioned, there's a social media toolkit. So if you don't feel comfortable taking pictures, we do have some graphics that are already pre-created, and there's actually some captions that are pre-created as well. But I also wanted to just reiterate the point that if you do want to have more creative control and add a little bit more details about how your meeting went, I also included some prompts that are going to be available for you in the participant handbook. So all of these are some things just to keep in mind. But that is overall just some little quick notes on the comm section. I can move on to the next slide. All right, perfect. Yeah, so as mentioned, we have the social media toolkit that's currently available, and we're also looking into having a press release coming out soon, and we're looking into the press conference. So once that is available, we can also forward that information to you, so you can forward to your local media contacts. We also have an email template available for you to access as well. So that is it for comms. So I'll pass it back to you, Nita.
Thanks. As far as trainings are concerned, you're attending this training, which I hope you find helpful. We will have the same training on August 9th for anyone who was not able to attend. We will also send out a recording of this, as I mentioned, and all of your packets and information. For those of you who may be newer to advocacy and congressional meetings, we do have some pre-recorded workshops that we've done in the past that could be helpful. Some of the topics include Government 101 and 201, effective refugee storytelling and messaging tips, organizing and leadership, and how to engage elected officials and best advocacy practices. So feel free to check those out if you find them helpful. And as far as what is next from here, so let's go to the next slide. So your group lead and accompaniers are working to schedule meetings with members of Congress. We have been working together to get those meetings scheduled for you all. This next week, you should hear from them to set up a check-in. It should be a virtual group call that you all set up, and they will share with you the scheduled meeting dates and locations and times, if they are virtual, if they are in person. And to best prepare your next steps, if you can review the participant handbook, which we will share out to you, and we'll put it in the chat box as well. And if you need, as I mentioned, the pre-recorded options. If you need any assistance, have any questions, or you're not sure of something, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm very responsive. So don't feel free to reach out anytime. And that being said, the next slide includes a lot of these handouts for you. We have a talking points sheet, the participant handbook, which will have all of the links for you, including some of the policy asks and all that good stuff. We do have all of the member profiles for your state, so you can kind of take a look at your member profile from your state. And as I mentioned, the policy asks and the leave behind folder. The leave behind folder is really going to the member of Congress and their staffer, and your accompanier will be sending that after your meeting to them. So I think that kind of wraps up our slides. I want to open it up for questions for you all, if you have any questions for us. So feel free to unmute yourself or put in the chat box. Yes, is it Moeen?
Yes, Moeen Amini here. How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Great. Sorry for delay.
No worries. Did you have a question?
Let me be here for a while. Maybe I will have some questions. Let me hear first from you all.
Okay. Other folks have any questions? Feel free to ask if you have any policy questions, any talking point questions.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has become evident, particularly at the border where we see the family separation has become part of some of the Border Patrol thinking that these are bad parents and that's the reason that folks need to be separated, is that we need to get at some of the root causes. And in particular,
All right.
I put in the chat that statelessness issue where we basically declare people non-human because they are not accorded any human rights. To put that in one of our talking points, how do we even broach that or get to that? Or are we really saying that's not one of the talking points and we're going to focus in other areas?
Jennifer, do you want to answer that or do you want me to
Yeah.
answer it?
Well, I'll start. What I would say is if it's important to you and you definitely want to connect with your legislator on that, then absolutely mention it.
Okay.
For largest impact and where we have momentum is certainly the AAA, the Afghan
Right.
Adjustment Act, and Title 42, we continue to need to beat that drum. But by all means, if there is an issue that is important to you and related to everything that we're fighting for, you certainly raise it, especially if you can connect on it.
Yeah, I think, Jennifer, my particular thing out of it is that if I don't raise it, I feel like I'm always doing charity. Oh, feel sorry for these poor folks, rather than speaking to justice. We need systemic and structural change around these kinds of issues. And that's one of them, is when states are the only thing that accord human rights, how do we get to a point where we come up with some kind of either, and maybe it's just a different form, I need to bring it up, but it's been a concern of mine that we basically put people in a position of statelessness. And since states are the only thing that accord human rights, then they're non-human beings all the time. So how do we get past that? I don't know. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, definitely mention. I mean, you have this like really one bite at the apple, hopefully not one bite. Hopefully you're, forming these relationships and whatnot, but
Right.
You've got this audience.
Right.
Use it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I think there was a question on, can you speak more on the immediacy of the Afghan Adjustment Act? Many are having their humanitarian parole time come to an end and are subject to deportation. Is that
Yes.
correct, or am I interpreting this incorrectly?
No. So thankfully, the legislation speaks to that exactly. So if you look at the legislation, there'll be two, what are we calling it, Nellie? Like sort of two tranches of those eligible, or the timing of having your adjustment considered. So getting into the weeds here, on one side, it's SIVs, P1s and P2s, and then everyone else, all other humanitarian parolees will be seeking adjustment. They can all seek at the same time, but what that effectively does, once you file your application to seek adjustment, it ensures that you will not be put into removal proceedings, notwithstanding the timing of the humanitarian parole. It doesn't stay, in other words, freeze the humanitarian parole, but it does ensure that the person will not be put into removal proceedings, and also that the person will continue to be able to have work authorization in the United States. So those are very good pieces of the legislation. We talked a bit about the need for the adjustment status, but we're coming up with the 1-year anniversary of the fall of Kabul and the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan. And there has been concerns about the timing of the status of our humanitarian parolees, but that is in essence another reason to push for the passage of this legislation as soon as possible, because those provisions in the bill will ensure that those who are here under humanitarian parole, as long as they file for adjustment status, will not be put into removal proceedings.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I think Dauda there's a couple folks, but Dauda, I think I saw your hand up first.
Okay. Good afternoon and good morning. It depends where you are. And I want to thank first We All American for organizing this advocacy days. It's really inspiring to see that refugees, we are hosting our own advocacy days for the first time. So kudos to all the team members that have signed up. It's not a question. I just want to make a comment. Someone that have been in this advocacy days, both in person, virtual, and now we have an hybrid. One thing I just want to encourage, like Neely mentioned earlier, don't stress, don't overwhelm. But I would just encourage a team that is going to do a research. It's always good to start those meetings and with your senator or congressman to acknowledge a piece of legislation they passed, specific to the state, how that piece of legislation impacts the state, the positive does that have to the state. Start first and acknowledge, then you begin that conversation. Along that here in Louisiana, it goes a long way. And that was the highlight of one of our conversations that we had with our senator. And especially during the flooding, we acknowledged the legislation that is support and passed, and it goes a long way to build that relationship. So I just want to encourage members to do that homework and get someone within the team that will bring that up. So
That's a great point, Dauda. Thank you so much. That's very, very helpful. Okay, Jason, I think you're up next.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of what Mike had touched on. I had the pleasure of being in a couple of these different things for various causes before. It's definitely humanizing people and trying to see the big picture for these folks is great. But the average legislator we're meeting with is busy, overworked, and half the time doesn't know this is on the edge of being passed without their support. So the more we introduce, unfortunately, the more we take away from the message of we need two things from you, this and this. So and again, not just you're right, humanizing them, talking to them, telling about the big problem, but more specifically, always dialing it back in. If we could have your support in resolving these two issues, it would go a long way to doing X, and then after we can get beyond these sets of meetings, like you said, continuing to push for that stuff. But with these two immediate issues from a mobilization standpoint, I was in a recent set of meetings for my day job in the realtor world, and we met with 6 representatives in a day, a group of us, and not a single one of them said anything other than, I've never heard of that before. Of course that makes sense. Why wouldn't we support that? Why haven't we done this already? And then it turned around and did it. So the more we can keep the focus on the ask, the easier it is to push the group effort without stepping on anyone's toes. It's just easier that way, because we kind of assume we're going in ready for battle. Maybe we're just going in ready to talk to someone who has no idea what we're even there for.
Yes, those are great points, Jason. Be direct and don't be afraid to make the ask. Make sure that you ask them directly, and that way you get an answer. You want clarity, you want to be direct in asking. Okay, I think, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this. Is it Lozoff? You have your hand up?
Yes, thank you. It's Betsy Lozoff with Berrien Immigrant Solidarity Network in Michigan, Southwest Michigan. Around here, what we have a lot of direct experience with is asylum seekers. And so that our stories would be more about that than refugees. And so my question is that a problem to bring those stories in? I mean, some of the things that we're observing is the terrible situation that asylum seekers are in this limbo period, while they don't qualify for anything. No services, no nothing, no health care, no nothing, while they're trying to seek asylum. And I see that that's a different issue. So would it be better not to get into that at all, or what do you suggest?
I'll just jump in here. It depends on who you're meeting with. Obviously, actually, let me step back. If it's an incredibly important issue to your group, absolutely raise it. We're absolutely talking about asylum seekers here during this advocacy week. We're focused primarily on lifting Title 42, which is impeding people from seeking asylum getting into the United States to seek asylum. But by all means, and I will say, I mean, just black and white, you will have a more receptive audience generally to Democrat members and senators on the issue of asylum. Republican member offices and Senate offices will be polite about it, but they've generally been more receptive to refugee resettlement issues, and they do see, Republican staff and members do see the issues separately, although obviously there are a lot of commonalities between those seeking asylum here in the United States and actual refugees coming from other places. But again, as I said earlier, if this is an important issue to your constituency, and certainly if you're meeting with a member of Congress, a D or an R, you are their constituents. They are in office to serve you. We like to think that these issues, sort of transcend, specific state or community issues, that these are so humanitarian in nature that if you are an American and a legislator, you should be pushing for passage of these efforts. But the extent that you can always connect it to your state through constituency stories, those, yourself, a voter, maybe not an asylum seeker, a voter yet, but you can always make that connection, and they will listen. They will listen. Again, I go back to my, main point, Democrat offices will be more receptive to those issues. But if you feel absolutely on principle, I am got this member for 10 minutes or this staffer for 10 minutes, I'm going to raise it no matter their party affiliation, then do so.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I do want to expand on just really quickly with these advocacy days. I know many of us have many issues that are important to us. We see locally with refugees and asylum seekers that we, see and witness and deal with the families. And I just want to reiterate that it is important to, while we want to be flexible with the talking points, we do still want to make sure that we go back to the policy ask that we are sharing with you guys. So please do, keep that in mind with your group. I think there was another question. Is it Moin?
Yes, thank you for giving me the opportunity. First of all, I really appreciate the efforts taken to introduce the Afghan Adjustment Act to the Congress. I have a few questions here. As a Afghan refugee community elder here in Atlanta, I have a few concerns of people. I want to share it with you first, and I need your suggestion and advice about it. The first is right now, those people who don't have enough documents for SIV to be eligible to get refugee status, they're applying for asylum. But after hearing this good news about Afghan Adjustment Act, most of them have stopped the process because they have got a hope that there would be a direct pathway to the green card or permanent residency. So in this case, what they really need to do, or they need to proceed with asylum cases, or they really need to, because asylum is a very lengthy process, lots of things to do, or they need to wait for Afghan Adjustment Act, the results of this. So
Jennifer,
should I go for a second question?
Yeah, Jennifer, do you want to answer that, or?
Yeah, I'm not going to impart any legal advice right here. I'm actually an attorney, but not specifically to these issues. But what I will say to this and what we've been talking about, whomever the Afghan is being represented by, or whatever legal representation they are engaged with, that attorney should be making the determination whether to continue to seek the asylum pathway or adjustment under the act. And I believe there might be opportunity to pursue both avenues. I'm not sure if I'm making that up, but in essence, there'll be terms that you have to meet to under adjustment. And it may be someone's situation where they have a clearer pathway under asylum than under adjustment. So certainly legal representation in the immigration space should be consulted to make the determination which pathway potentially they should be seeking. Or, and I don't know the answer to this question, I did think I heard it, that you could potentially pursue both avenues until it's clear which one might be the more expeditious route.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. So I have another question as well. Actually, these are the concerns. I'm not sure if this is related to our today's conversation or not, but I just want to share it with you. Lots of people, they're left behind in Afghanistan, and they have had services with US government and military for many years, for several years, but for some reason they don't have the SIV documents to make them eligible, to get out of the country. And on the other hand, the community in Afghanistan, all and everyone knows those specific people and families that they've been providing services to US military. And right now their lives are on a big threat. And they really don't know any way to get out of the country because the borders are closed. There's no travel documents. There's no passport issues to those families. In this case, their life are on a critical threat on the human rights aspects. What do you think? Should we raise this issue on that day and ask about the solution? Because most of the families there keep contacting us and sharing their concern about their lives, that it is really in a critical threat. And right now the focus is only on the SIV documents, that if you have SIV complete documents, then you would be able to flew out of the country, or otherwise you have to stuck in Afghanistan. So I need to know from you.
Yeah, I'll certainly try to answer that question. So the good news is you really need to ask your member or senator to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act, because there is a provision that addresses this concern. I will say many who are engaged in this issue, members of Congress and senators, are well aware of at-risk Afghans still potentially at the mercy of the Taliban, still in Afghanistan. And quite frankly, that was one of the issues that certain Republicans kept raising in relation to putting together this bill. What about the people who are still left over there? We cannot forget them. We cannot just say, okay, let's give adjustment to everyone who's here now and we're done with it. So there are strong provisions in the bill. An interagency task force will address those applications that are made from those who still in Afghanistan or outside of the United States. I don't quite know the specifics, certainly, issues of documentation and whether there was true valid connection with the United States. Those will be heard, and determinations will be made on an interagency task force. But this is a major issue, well aware to those engaged in the issue in Congress, and certainly by our veterans groups who have been doing a lion's share of this advocacy work, making clear that our allies are still at the mercy of the Taliban, in hiding, have gone dark, and we cannot forget about them. So this population is certainly addressed in this legislation. All the more reason to get it passed.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the answer.
Thank you. And I did see a question from Akarash around endorsement or joining forces. Akarash, I know that we're trying to coordinate a call, you and I, so we can discuss this more in our call. Okay, I think if there are no more questions, we are going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you everyone so much for attending. Once again, we will follow up with the recording and send you all of the material a little bit later today. Thank you again so much for participating in our advocacy days. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you, and we'll conclude our training today.
Thanks.